The laughter started before the vote even ended, and I felt it hit me like a physical blow. My name is Oliver Hart, and I was sitting in the observation gallery of the Galactic Senate the day everything changed. I was not important. I was a junior attaché, barely 26 years old, assigned to carry datapads and translate footnotes nobody else wanted to read. I had no vote, no voice, no weight in that chamber, but I was there. I saw it happen with my own eyes, and I have never been able to forget a single second of it. The Senate chamber was built to make you feel small. The ceiling rose higher than any structure I had ever stood inside, ribbed with dark metal that seemed to breathe with the slow pulse of some ancient life support system older than my own species' recorded history. Delegates from 43 worlds sat in curved rows that spiraled upward like a shell, each one lit by a soft color that marked their homeworld. Human blue was near the bottom, close to the floor, in the section reserved for petitioning species. That placement alone told you everything about how we were regarded. Our ambassador stood at the center podium. Her name was Helen Ashcroft, and she had spent 11 years building relationships across 100 different systems just to earn humanity this one hearing. She stood straight, hands folded, waiting for permission to speak, while above her the delegates murmured to each other in a dozen languages that the translation implants rendered into a single overlapping hum in my ear. When she was finally given the floor, she spoke calmly. She described what humanity could offer. She spoke of our engineers, our medical researchers, our willingness to cooperate on shared infrastructure. She spoke of the small joint projects we had already completed quietly, without asking for recognition. She asked, simply, for provisional membership, not full rights, not a seat on the council, just a foothold, a place at the table where decisions were made about the space we all shared. That was when Councillor Vex rose from his seat. Vex represented the Trellador Compact, one of the oldest and most powerful blocks in the Senate. He was tall, silver-skinned, with a voice that had been trained for centuries of political theater. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply let his words fall into the silence, like stones into still water. He asked the chamber how a species that had only just learned to leave its own solar system under its own power could possibly be trusted with the safety of others. He asked how a species with a documented history of internal conflict, still visible in their own historical records, could be expected to behave responsibly among the stars. He called us, in his exact words, charming in our ambition and dangerous in our haste. Then he smiled, and the chamber laughed. It was not a small laugh. It rolled across the tiers like a wave, delegate after delegate joining in, some out of genuine amusement, some simply because it was safer to laugh with the powerful than to sit in silence. I felt my face go hot with anger, and something worse than anger, something closer to shame. Even though I had done nothing wrong. I looked down at Ambassador Ashcroft, expecting her to argue back, to raise her voice, to defend us the way I desperately wanted someone to defend us. She did not. She stood there, waited for the laughter to fade on its own, and then reached into the small case at her side and wrote something down on a data slate. I remember thinking it was strange. Everyone else in that chamber was either laughing or watching the laughter, and she was writing. Not arguing, not pleading, writing as if she were simply noting the time. The Senate President called for order, though he did not seem particularly bothered by the disruption. He turned to the floor and asked for a formal vote on humanity's petition for provisional membership. I watched the tally lights above the chamber floor turn red, one section at a time. Red for denial. There were a few pockets of blue, mostly from smaller species who had worked directly with human engineers on remote stations, but they were nowhere near enough. Within 2 minutes, the vote was closed. Denied, by an overwhelming majority. Then came the second announcement, and this was the part that truly silenced the room, though not in the way you might expect. The Senate President, citing what he called growing concerns for the safety and stability of shared territories, revoked humanity's existing provisional status entirely. All human vessels, personnel, and installations operating in shared systems and joint stations were to be withdrawn within 48 hours. He framed it as a protective measure. He framed it as being for our own good and for the good of everyone else. I remember looking at the countdown that appeared on the display above the chamber floor. 47 hours, 59 minutes, and counting down. I turned to look at Ambassador Ashcroft one more time before the session closed. She was gathering her things calmly, unhurried, as if she had expected this outcome from the very beginning. She caught my eye for a brief moment. There was no anger in her expression, no fear, just something quiet and unreadable, something I would spend the following weeks trying to understand. As the delegates filed out, still laughing, still trading amused comments about the presumption of a species barely out of its own cradle, I stayed in my seat a moment longer, staring at that countdown. 47 hours and 52 minutes. I did not know it then, but that number would become the last piece of comedy the galaxy would ever get from humanity. I left the gallery and found Ambassador Ashcroft in the corridor outside, speaking quietly with two of her aides. She was not composing a protest. She was not drafting an appeal. She was issuing instructions, calm and specific, the way you might organize a routine relocation rather than respond to a humiliating and public rejection. I asked her, perhaps too boldly for someone of my rank, whether we were going to file a formal objection. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said something I did not understand at the time. She said that the Senate had asked us to leave, and that humanity always took people at their word the first time they said it. I did not understand what she meant. I assumed she meant we would withdraw peacefully and continue seeking membership through other channels later, through patience and diplomacy, the long, slow game that species like the Trellador Compact had mastered over centuries. I assumed this was simply a setback, one of many we would recover from, the way we always seemed to. I had no idea that within days, the quiet, methodical way that fleet of human ships would begin leaving every joint station, every shared research post, every border outpost, would feel less like a retreat and more like the closing of a door that had been holding something back. I walked out of the Senate building that evening into the artificial dusk of the station's atmosphere dome, and above me, through the transparent ceiling, I could see the lights of 100 docked vessels from a dozen different species, all going about their business as if nothing important had happened, as if a countdown had not just begun, as if laughter had not just replaced diplomacy in front of the entire galaxy. I did not laugh. Something in Ambassador Ashcroft's calm expression had lodged itself in my chest, and it would not let go. I kept thinking about how she had written something down during the laughter, instead of reacting to it. I kept wondering what exactly she had written, and who it had been meant for. I would find out soon enough, though not in the way I expected, because over the next 2 days, I would watch something happen that no one in that laughing chamber was prepared for. Not an argument, not a protest, not even anger, just silence, and the sound of ships leaving without a single farewell transmission. The countdown reached 0 on a quiet morning, and nothing exploded, nothing burned, nothing announced itself with noise of any kind. That was the strangest part. I had spent my whole life assuming that important moments arrived with some kind of signal, a siren, a broadcast, a voice cutting through static to tell you history was happening. Instead, I woke to a message from my supervisor asking me to report to the docking observation deck because the Human Logistics Division was completing its withdrawal and someone needed to file a final status report. I arrived to find the deck nearly empty. A handful of station staff from other species stood near the viewing windows, murmuring to each other, pointing at something in the distance. I walked over and looked out through the reinforced glass, and there they were, human vessels, dozens of them, disengaging from docking clamps in smooth, practiced sequences, exactly on schedule, exactly on time, without a single delay or complication. I had expected chaos. I had expected angry transmissions flooding the communication channels, official complaints, perhaps even a symbolic gesture of defiance, something to show the Senate that we would not simply vanish quietly into the dark, without at least expressing how unjust this decision had been. Instead, every human ship followed procedure with a precision that felt almost rehearsed. No wasted movement, no lingering, no parting words. I was assigned as a liaison to monitor the final hours of the withdrawal, mostly because I was one of the few people on staff who had any working relationship with human personnel. My supervisor believed this made me useful. I believed it made me the only person in that building who might actually understand what was happening, though at the time I understood very little. I found Nora Ellison in one of the last occupied service bays, overseeing the transfer of equipment logs to a departing supply vessel. Nora had worked alongside station staff for nearly 6 years. She had trained new arrivals, mediated disputes between departments, and had once spent an entire night helping me untangle a translation error that nearly caused a diplomatic incident over cargo manifests. I considered her a friend, as much as our very different lives allowed for that word. She looked up when I approached, and for a moment her expression softened into something like sadness, though she quickly composed herself into the same calm efficiency I had seen in Ambassador Ashcroft the day before. I asked her the only question I could think to ask. I asked her why no one was angry. I told her that if our positions were reversed, if my people had been laughed at and expelled in front of the entire galaxy, I imagined there would be shouting, protests, demands for apology. I told her the silence frightened me more than any argument could have. She paused for a long moment before answering. She told me that humanity had learned, long before it ever reached the stars, that arguing with people who have already decided not to listen rarely changes anything. She said that when someone tells you plainly that you are not wanted somewhere, the wisest response is not to convince them otherwise, but simply to leave, and to let the absence speak for itself. I told her that felt like giving up. She shook her head and told me it was the opposite of giving up. She said it was recognizing exactly what a decision like that actually meant, and choosing not to waste more time proving a point to people who had already made their choice. Before she boarded her transport, she turned back to me one last time. She told me I would understand everything soon, and that she was sorry it had to happen this way. I asked her what she meant by that, but she only offered a small, tired smile before disappearing through the airlock, and the door sealed behind her with a soft mechanical hiss that felt far too final for something so quiet. Over the following hours, I watched station after station report the same pattern. Human research teams closing down joint laboratories with careful, thorough handovers, leaving behind detailed documentation so that ongoing projects would not simply collapse the moment they left. Human maintenance crews completing their final safety checks on shared infrastructure before departing, making certain that nothing would be left in a dangerous state, even though no one had asked them to bother. Human diplomatic staff closing their offices, filing their final reports, and boarding transports without a single public statement to the press networks that had spent the last 2 days mocking our expulsion in increasingly gleeful commentary. It was almost too orderly, almost too complete, as if this exact scenario had already been planned for long before the Senate ever called its vote. By the end of the second day, every human vessel and every piece of human personnel had cleared every shared station, every joint research post, and every contested border territory across dozens of systems. The withdrawal had been executed with a level of precision that seemed impossible for a decision made only 48 hours earlier. I began to notice smaller things as the days passed. The communication relay towers near several joint stations, towers that everyone had simply assumed were ancient infrastructure left behind by some long-vanished precursor civilization, began experiencing intermittent outages. No one connected this to the withdrawal at first. Most delegates in the Senate press briefings joked about the timing being a coincidence, or dismissed the outages as routine maintenance issues that would resolve themselves. I remember sitting in the station cafeteria that evening, listening to 2 delegates from neighboring systems laugh about how quiet and dramatic humanity's departure had been. One of them joked that we were sulking, retreating to lick our wounds after being publicly humiliated, and that we would likely come crawling back within a few months once we realized how much we needed the galaxy's markets and resources. I did not laugh with them. Something about the precision I had witnessed, the calm efficiency, the complete absence of protest or argument, told me this was not sulking. Sulking is loud in its own quiet way. It demands attention even while pretending not to want it. What I had seen was something else entirely. It was not an emotional retreat. It was the deliberate, careful execution of a decision, the kind of decision made only after every contingency had already been considered and prepared for in advance. I began pulling old records that night, partly out of professional obligation, since my supervisor wanted a full report on the withdrawal's operational details, and partly because Nora's words kept circling back through my mind. She had told me I would understand soon. I did not want to wait for soon. I wanted to understand now, before whatever was coming arrived without warning. I started with the joint infrastructure agreements, the treaties and contracts that governed which species maintained which systems across our shared territories. I expected human involvement to be modest, limited to a handful of research stations and minor trade routes, the kind of contribution that matched the small, dismissive reputation the Senate had assigned us. What I found instead unsettled me deeply. Human engineering teams had been responsible for maintaining significant portions of the deep space relay network, the very system that allowed instant communication across vast distances between systems. I had always assumed this network was ancient precursor technology, inherited rather than built, since no single species in the Senate had ever openly claimed credit for its construction. As I dug deeper into maintenance logs and technical registries, I found human signatures on repair records, stretching back years, quiet, unglamorous work performed without any fanfare or recognition. I found similar patterns in border stability reports from 3 contested regions where tensions between rival species had simmered for over a decade. Officially, these conflicts had been managed through careful, ongoing diplomatic mediation, credited to a rotating committee of neutral observers. Unofficially, buried in footnotes and internal correspondence, I found human names appearing again and again as the actual mediators who had quietly kept those regions from erupting into open conflict, working behind the scenes without ever claiming public credit for their efforts. I sat back from my desk that night with a growing unease settling into my chest. The Senate had laughed at a species they believed to be young, impulsive, and barely capable of managing its own affairs, let alone contributing meaningfully to the wider galaxy. Yet everywhere I looked, I found humanity quietly embedded in the very foundations that held our fragile cooperative peace together, doing essential work without ever demanding recognition for it. I thought about Ambassador Ashcroft writing calmly on her data slate, while the chamber laughed around her. I thought about Nora's tired smile before she boarded her transport. I thought about the precision of the withdrawal, executed exactly on schedule, without complication, as if the decision to leave had already been anticipated long before anyone in that chamber ever called for a vote. I did not sleep well that night. Something told me the silence I had witnessed was not an ending. It was the beginning of something the Senate had never bothered to ask about, and now, having laughed away the chance to understand it peacefully, they were about to learn it the hard way instead. My supervisor read my report the next morning and told me, without much interest, to file it and move on to other duties. She did not seem alarmed by what I had found. She waved it away as historical curiosity, interesting perhaps, but not urgent. I remember feeling a strange kind of loneliness in that moment, the sense that I had uncovered something significant and no one around me was willing to take it seriously. So I kept digging on my own time, staying late in the station archives long after my shifts ended, cross-referencing old contracts, shipping manifests, and technical registries that had not been accessed in years. I wanted to understand exactly how deep humanity's quiet involvement went, and the deeper I searched, the more uneasy I became. I discovered that the hollow drift, a treacherous stretch of space notorious for its unpredictable gravitational disturbances, had only ever been reliably navigable because of a specific class of human vessel equipped with adaptive stabilization technology. Nearly a third of the galaxy's shipping routes depended on safe passage through that corridor, since alternate paths added weeks or even months to travel times for cargo and passengers alike. I had always assumed multiple species maintained safe passage through the drift independently. Instead, I found records showing that human pilots had quietly handled the vast majority of transit escort duties for years, guiding other species' ships through safely, again without ever seeking recognition or payment beyond standard shipping fees. I found myself wondering how something this significant could have gone almost entirely unnoticed by the wider public. The answer, I slowly realized, was not that humanity had hidden these contributions deliberately in secrecy. It was simply that no one had bothered to ask. Humanity had never advertised its usefulness. It had never leveraged its quiet indispensability as a bargaining chip in negotiations, never used it to demand better treatment or greater respect in the Senate. It had simply done the work, consistently and reliably, while the rest of the galaxy assumed such infrastructure existed on its own, inherited from some ancient civilization long since vanished. I began to understand why Counselor Vex and so many others had found it so easy to laugh at us. We had never once threatened anyone with the possibility of our absence. We had never used our quiet contributions as leverage. We had simply been present, useful, and unassuming things are easy to dismiss, easy to mock, easy to imagine surviving without. I brought my growing collection of findings to a colleague of mine named Edward Lambert, a records analyst who had access to broader interspecies infrastructure databases than I did through my diplomatic clearance alone. Edward was skeptical at first, assuming I had simply misread outdated contracts or misunderstood the complexity of shared maintenance agreements. But as I walked him through the evidence, station by station, system by system, his skepticism slowly gave way to something closer to alarm. Together, we compiled a more complete picture over the following days. Human engineering teams maintained critical sections of the deep space relay network across at least 6 major shipping corridors. Human diplomatic staff had quietly mediated 3 separate long-standing border conflicts, preventing them from escalating into open hostilities for years. Human pilots handled the overwhelming majority of safe transit through the hollow drift. Human medical researchers had contributed significant advances to shared healthcare initiatives on outer colony worlds that had no other reliable access to advanced treatment. None of this had ever been publicly credited to humanity in any meaningful way. It had simply been absorbed into the galaxy's daily functioning, treated as background infrastructure rather than active contribution, the way you might take clean air or reliable gravity for granted without ever wondering who or what maintained it. Edward asked me the question that had been circling in my own mind for days. He asked what would happen to all of this now that humanity had withdrawn completely. I did not have a full answer yet, but I had a growing suspicion, and it filled me with a dread I struggled to put into words. I told him I believed we were about to find out very soon, and not in a gentle way. I decided to compile everything Edward and I had found into a single comprehensive report, something detailed enough that even the most dismissive Senate official would be forced to take it seriously. I worked through 2 consecutive nights preparing it, cross-checking every figure, every date, every contract reference, determined that no one would be able to dismiss my findings as speculation or exaggeration. While preparing the report, I came across something that struck me even harder than the infrastructure data. Buried within an old joint communication archive, I found a series of quiet inquiries humanity's diplomatic corps had submitted over the previous 3 years, each one requesting formal recognition of their ongoing contributions to shared systems, each one requesting a fair renegotiation of their standing within the Senate that reflected the responsibilities they had quietly assumed. Every single inquiry had been either ignored, delayed indefinitely through procedural technicalities, or dismissed outright by the very same delegates who had laughed at Ambassador Ashcroft during the vote. Humanity had asked, repeatedly and patiently, to be treated fairly in proportion to what it contributed. It had never demanded special privileges. It had never threatened withdrawal as leverage. It had simply asked, again and again, for its work to be acknowledged, and for its standing to reflect the reality of its contributions. Each time, the answer had effectively been no, though rarely in those exact words. The Senate had preferred to let the arrangement continue exactly as it was, extracting the benefits of humanity's quiet reliability while continuing to treat us as a lesser presence unworthy of genuine partnership. I finally understood, with a clarity that left me cold, that the vote to deny our provisional membership and revoke our standing entirely had not been some isolated moment of poor judgment born from a single embarrassing speech. It had been the final answer to years of quiet, patient, repeatedly ignored requests. The laughter in that chamber had simply been the visible surface of a much deeper and longer pattern of dismissal. I thought again about Ambassador Ashcroft writing calmly on her data slate while the Senate laughed around her. I no longer believed she had been recording some spontaneous reaction to that specific moment. I now suspected she had been documenting the final confirmation of something humanity's leadership had already anticipated for a very long time, perhaps years, waiting only for this exact kind of definitive rejection before finally acting on a decision that had been prepared long in advance. I completed my report in the early hours of the following morning, exhausted but certain of what I had found. I submitted it through official channels, flagged for urgent Senate review, hoping desperately that someone in a position of real authority would read it before the consequences I feared became impossible to reverse. I did not have to wait long to find out whether my warning had come in time. Within 2 days, the first relay outages that had been dismissed as routine maintenance stopped being minor inconveniences and became something the entire Senate could no longer ignore. The first major collapse happened in the outer relay corridor, connecting 3 trading systems that depended entirely on instant communication for coordinating cargo schedules. Without warning, the relay network in that sector failed completely, cutting off real-time contact between systems that had never once experienced a full communication blackout in over a decade. Ships already in transit found themselves unable to receive updated coordinates or safety warnings, and 2 cargo vessels nearly collided in a crowded docking approach because neither pilot received the traffic adjustment that would normally have been transmitted instantly. I heard about the incident within hours through emergency notices circulating across every diplomatic channel. Panic spread quickly among traders and station administrators who had never considered the possibility that this relay network could simply stop functioning. Within a single day, 3 more sectors reported similar outages, each one more severe than the last, as the network's automated backup systems, designed and maintained by teams that no longer existed within the Senate's reach, began failing in cascading sequence. I attended an emergency session of the Senate Infrastructure Committee, invited only because my earlier report had finally reached the right people, though far later than I had hoped. The mood in that chamber was nothing like the confident, amused atmosphere I remembered from the vote just days earlier. Delegates spoke over each other in rising alarm, demanding answers about why critical infrastructure was failing so suddenly and so completely. I watched Councillor Vex, the same delegate who had led the laughter against Ambassador Ashcroft, stand and demand to know who currently held maintenance authority over the relay network. When the committee's technical advisor explained, with visible discomfort, that human engineering teams had handled the overwhelming majority of relay maintenance for years, the chamber fell into a silence far more uncomfortable than any laughter had ever been. Vex asked, his voice noticeably less composed than before, how quickly human teams could be recalled to restore the network. The technical advisor explained, as gently as possible, that human diplomatic and technical personnel had been formally expelled from all shared territories only days earlier, per the Senate's own directive, and that all attempts to reach human communication channels since the withdrawal had gone completely unanswered. I watched something shift in that room, a slow dawning realization spreading across faces that had been so confident and dismissive just days before. The very decision they had celebrated with laughter was now directly responsible for the crisis unfolding around them. Over the following days, the situation worsened steadily. The border regions that human diplomats had quietly stabilized for years began showing renewed signs of tension as the delicate balance those diplomats had maintained through careful, ongoing mediation started to unravel without anyone present to manage it. 2 rival delegations that had coexisted peacefully under human-brokered agreements began exchanging increasingly hostile formal complaints, each accusing the other of violating boundaries that had never been seriously challenged in years. The hollow drift became the most immediate and visible crisis of all, Without human pilots available to guide transit through its unpredictable gravitational disturbances, 3 separate cargo convoys attempting the crossing on their own suffered severe navigational failures within the same week. One convoy lost partial cargo integrity due to unexpected gravitational shifts that human-piloted ships had always anticipated and compensated for automatically. Insurance disputes exploded across shipping networks as companies scrambled to understand why a corridor that had operated safely for years had suddenly become treacherous again. I found myself fielding a constant stream of urgent questions from station officials and delegates who suddenly remembered that I had some limited history working alongside human personnel. Everyone wanted to know the same thing: how could they reach humanity again? How could they request assistance, or at the very least, request guidance on managing the infrastructure that had been so quietly essential for so long? I told them the truth, as painful as it was to repeat. Human diplomatic channels had gone completely silent the moment the Senate's vote was finalized. No hails were being answered. No emergency requests were receiving any response. It was not that humanity was refusing to communicate out of anger or spite. It was simply that they had taken the Senate's decision at face value, immediately and completely, exactly as Ambassador Ashcroft had quietly indicated she would on that very first day. I remember one delegate, visibly frustrated, asking why humanity would not at least respond to emergency requests, given the scale of disruption now affecting dozens of systems. I told him what I had come to understand through my research and through my conversations with Nora before she departed. Humanity had asked, repeatedly and patiently, for years, to be treated as genuine partners rather than tolerated guests. Each request had been ignored or dismissed. When the Senate finally answered clearly, through both the vote and the expulsion order, humanity had chosen to honor that answer completely, without hesitation and without exception. This was not vengeance. It was not a calculated punishment designed to force the Senate into submission through crisis and desperation. It was simply the direct, immediate, and complete consequence of a decision the Senate itself had made, executed by a species that had decided long ago never to overstay its welcome once it had been clearly and formally told it was not wanted. I watched the Senate scramble in increasing desperation over the following days, attempting to recruit alternative engineering teams from other species to address the relay failures, attempting to negotiate temporary safe passage arrangements through the hollow drift using untested technology, attempting to send neutral mediators into the reignited border conflicts. Every attempt fell short in some critical way, either through lack of sufficient technical expertise, lack of established trust between rival parties, or simply lack of time to develop solutions that had taken humanity years of quiet, careful work to perfect. I was called before the full Senate committee once more, this time not to deliver a warning that would be dismissed, but to answer direct questions about anything I might know regarding how to re-establish contact with human authorities. I told them honestly that I did not have direct access to any human leadership beyond the working relationships I had built with individual personnel like Nora, relationships that had ended the moment those personnel departed through sealed airlocks that would not open again. Counselor Vex, who just days earlier had commanded the room with easy confidence and cutting humor, now looked older somehow, drawn and visibly shaken. He asked me directly, in front of the full assembled committee, whether I believed humanity would ever consider returning if the Senate formally apologized and offered to reconsider its earlier decision. I told him honestly that I did not know. I told him what I believed to be true based on everything I had learned. Humanity had not left in anger, seeking an apology or a reversal. They had left because they had been told plainly they were not wanted, and they had chosen to respect that answer immediately and completely, without argument, without protest, and without any apparent expectation of ever needing to return. I watched the weight of that realization settle across the chamber. The Senate had spent years quietly benefiting from a species they dismissed as young and unworthy of real partnership, and now, faced with the sudden and complete absence of that quiet contribution, they were finally beginning to understand exactly what they had laughed away. I left that session with a growing certainty that words alone would not resolve what had happened. Someone would need to go and speak with humanity directly, not through official channels that had already been decisively closed, but through whatever personal connection still remained. I already suspected, with a mixture of dread and quiet determination, that this task would eventually fall to me. The Senate committee approved my assignment 3 days later, though approved is a generous word for what actually happened. No one else wanted the task, and I was the only person on staff with any personal history among human personnel, however limited that history truly was. I was given a small unarmed shuttle, a set of coordinates gathered from the last known trajectory of departing human vessels, and very little else beyond a quiet hope that I would be allowed to make contact at all. I traveled for 6 days through mostly empty space, watching the star charts update slowly as I moved beyond the boundaries of territory the Senate had ever mapped in detail. Human space, it turned out, was far larger and better organized than most delegates had ever assumed, though from the outside it revealed almost nothing of itself. No aggressive patrol ships intercepted me. No warning transmissions ordered me to turn back. There was simply a quiet, steady sense of being watched, the feeling of passing through territory that had already decided exactly how far it would allow me to travel before making its next move clear. On the 6th day, I found them. The human home fleet was gathered at what I can only describe as the edge of their space, though calling it a fleet feels almost misleading, since there was no aggressive formation, no weapons visibly primed, no defensive posture of any kind. Hundreds of vessels sat in calm, orderly clusters, engines idle, running lights steady and unthreatening. It looked less like a military presence preparing for conflict and more like a community that had simply gathered quietly at its own front door, waiting to see who might come knocking. My shuttle was guided in by a calm, professional voice that gave clear, simple instructions without a trace of hostility or suspicion. I was escorted to a docking bay aboard what appeared to be a central coordination vessel, larger than the others, but no more heavily armed, its design practical rather than intimidating. I was met at the airlock by a small group of unarmed personnel who introduced themselves politely and led me through quiet corridors that reminded me more of a well-organized research facility than any warship I had imagined. Everyone I passed moved with calm purpose, none of the tension or urgency I had expected from a species supposedly in the middle of some grand confrontation with the wider galaxy. Eventually, I was brought to a modest conference room where Ambassador Helen Ashcroft sat waiting, exactly as composed as she had been the day the Senate laughed at her. She greeted me warmly, almost as if we had simply met again after a routine diplomatic recess rather than the collapse of interspecies infrastructure across dozens of systems. She offered me a seat and a simple cup of tea, and for a moment, sitting there in that quiet room, it was difficult to remember that I had come here representing a Senate in the middle of genuine crisis. I explained everything as clearly and honestly as I could. I described the relay outages, the reignited border conflicts, the failed crossings through the hollow drift, the growing desperation among delegates who had finally begun to understand exactly what humanity's quiet presence had actually meant to the stability of shared space. I told her about Councillor Vex's question, about whether humanity would ever consider returning if the Senate offered a formal apology. She listened patiently, without interrupting, her expression calm and unreadable in the same way it had been during that first fateful vote. When I finished, she asked me a single question in return. She asked whether the Senate had reconsidered its formal findings regarding humanity's capacity for civilized cooperation, the very findings that had justified our expulsion in the first place. I told her honestly that I did not know the full answer, though I suspected the crisis itself had already answered that question for most delegates, whether or not they were willing to say so publicly yet. She nodded slowly, and then she told me something I have carried with me ever since. She said that humanity had never wanted to prove itself through argument or persuasion because words are cheap and easily dismissed by those who have already decided not to listen. She said humanity had instead chosen to let its absence speak for itself, quietly and completely, so that anyone willing to pay attention could finally understand exactly what had been taken for granted for so long. She told me humanity was not interested in demanding an apology, nor in punishing the Senate for its decision through prolonged suffering or extended crisis. She said humanity had simply been waiting, patiently, to see whether the Senate would eventually understand on its own what years of quiet requests and patient diplomacy had failed to communicate. I asked her directly whether humanity intended to return to shared space at all. She smiled, faintly, and told me that the decision would depend entirely on what the Senate chose to do next, not out of desperation or crisis management, but out of genuine reconsideration of how it valued the species within its reach. She said humanity had no interest in returning to a table where it would once again be dismissed the moment its usefulness was quietly restored and its contributions were once again taken for granted. I left that meeting without a clear answer to bring back to the Senate, though I understood, more clearly than I ever had before, exactly what had happened over those past weeks. The Senate had spent years benefiting from a species it viewed as beneath serious consideration, extracting quiet value from our presence while denying us any genuine voice in the decisions that shaped our shared existence. When finally given the choice to either acknowledge that value honestly or dismiss it completely, the Senate had laughed, and humanity had simply accepted that answer at face value, immediately and without argument. There had been no threats, no ultimatums, no dramatic declarations of grievance broadcast across every channel for the galaxy to witness. Just a quiet, orderly withdrawal, executed with the same careful precision humanity had always applied to its unglamorous, unrecognized work, followed by a silence that had said more in its absence than any speech ever could have said in its presence. I returned to the Senate with my report, knowing it would likely take far longer than a single meeting for genuine change to take root among delegates who had spent generations assuming their own judgment could never be seriously questioned. I did not know whether humanity would ever return to full partnership within our shared space, or whether this quiet separation would become permanent, a lasting reminder of exactly what had been lost the day laughter replaced honest consideration. What I did know, standing once again in that same towering Senate chamber where it had all begun, was this: the delegates who had laughed so easily that day had learned, in the weeks that followed, that some answers do not require raised voices or dramatic declarations to be heard clearly. Sometimes the most powerful response a people can offer is simply to leave exactly when asked, without complaint, without negotiation, and without a single sound, and to let the silence that follows teach the lesson that words alone never could. The Senate had laughed, humanity had listened, and answered, without a sound.